veterans, our returned servicemen and women, the members of our armed and emergency services, RSA volunteers and officials from the East Coast Bays, Birkenhead and Devonport RSAs, and their presidents, Kerry Kay, Linda Gage and Johnny Walker. Community leaders and representatives, ladies and gentlemen, we are here today in this, the final year of the centennial celebrations of World War I, to remember, to commemorate and to honour our Anzacs and the virtues that they embodied. Today is a chance for us to reflect on the effects of a war which touched the lives of every New Zealand family, and to honour our veterans' contribution to the peace, the freedom and the security that our country enjoys today. It is also a day to honour and appreciate both our veterans and those currently serving in our armed forces, and to applaud those incredibly brave and men and women who walk among us and who have made sacrifices and served our country. 103 years ago today, the first Anzacs landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Over the coming months, they would face a bloody and insurmountable fight. Nearly 100,000 New Zealand men and women were farewelled from our shores over the course of the war. 18,000 didn't come home. The 12th of October 1917 remains New Zealand's darkest day. At Bellevue Spur, 845 New Zealanders lost their lives, still more than any other day. A further 2,700 were wounded. With such great loss, it is important that we continue to reflect on the sacrifice made in the fields of Belgium at Passchendaele. For those who returned, life was never the same. Many of those boys carried with them the trauma of war their entire lives and never spoke of what they witnessed. One of those returned soldiers was my great-grandfather, Private John Henry Brown of the Northern Wairoa Battalion. He left for France on the 28th of May 1917. He fought on the front lines of Messines and was later wounded at Gravenstapel Spur, part of the fierce Battle of Passchendaele. He was sent back to New Zealand on the hospital ship Maheno, wounded both physically and mentally. He never spoke of what he saw during the war. He carried that with him all his life, until he penned a letter to his cousin in 1974, and I thought I would share with you a small section of that letter today. On the day I was wounded, we had been withdrawn 2.5 miles. My mate, Jim Mulholland, and I had dug into an old shell hole, collected several ground sheets and a good warm posse. I threw my gear down in the left corner, his on the right, but Jim had inadvertently sat down on my gear. All equipment looked the same. I told him it was my gear, but he may as well stay there. We were actually sitting shoulder to shoulder. A few minutes later, over it came. We were both covered, buried I should say, but I managed to get my head clear, my left foot about level with my face, and I could see the shell had made a complete cut, my boot and foot behind the toes. There was no pain, just a perfectly cut off boot and toes, and my first thought was, there's a trip to New Zealand. After several attempts, I managed to get to my feet. I could not clear the earth from Jim's head. I had to hang on to my smashed arm. Ultimately, I got out of the shell hole and I yelled to my mate, who called for stretcher bearers to come and collect me while he ran to Jim. He later came back to the field station to ask me who my mate was, as he had been smashed up completely and was not recognisable. Jim Mulholland was a fine chap. How I have often envied him his fate. I reckon Jim cheated me. He had the best of the bargain. All his troubles vanished at 2:30 in the afternoon of October 4, 1917. My great-grandfather never spoke of this trauma to anyone, never shared the guilt that he carried of having his mate perish beside him, when in fact, if it had not been for a simple mistake, it would have been him that passed that day. Some months after my grandfather's story took place, in November 1918, the armistice was declared, and the toll of New Zealand's contribution became clear. Such great casualties are barely able to be comprehended for a small, distant nation at the bottom of the Pacific. Lives were permanently and irreparably changed for those who made it home. It is incumbent on all of us to protect the legacy left by our veterans, to continue to pay gratitude for their service, and to acknowledge their selflessness, their moral and physical courage and their honour. Year after year, I am heartened by the swelling numbers of young people I see attending Anzac services. Future generations will carry the mantle for commemorating our servicemen and women who returned and for those who didn't. We can but imagine the horrors that our veterans endured. The responsibility that lies with us is to take heed of their lessons and build a more peaceful world to prevent war and bloodshed. We must never stop paying respect for their sacrifices. To our Defence Force personnel, the police, the fire service and the ambulance services, thank you for your work, often in the face of danger, to preserve the freedoms that our veterans fought for. Veterans and returned servicemen and women, thank you for your bravery, your selflessness and your devotion to forging a safe, free and prosperous New Zealand that my generation and those beyond can enjoy. Today, and on Anzac Day in the years to come, let us honour those men and women possessed with qualities so remarkable that we should always remember them, lest we forget.